May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be found acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. So I think there's something about humans or human nature that loves a good origin story. Origin myths and legends are woven into the cultural fabric of different societies. Think about the founding of Rome and the story of Romulus and Remus, or in our contemporary myths and legends like comic book superheroes. We know about the origin story of Batman and Spider-Man, and those origin stories tell us not only about the person's identity or where they came from, but also why they do what they do. It tells us something about their mission and purpose. This is why they fight crime, because they've had this experience in the past, this moment of crisis and turmoil that changed the way they saw the world. Origin stories can also be important in our real life, everyday communities and organizations. I've just returned from an overnight retreat at the Richmond Hill Retreat Center, which is a retreat house and intentional community in Richmond. And I went there with a group of our ECLF, or Episcopal Church Leadership Fellows, so students from UVA, went there for an overnight retreat, and as part of our orientation, in addition to getting important things like the Wi-Fi password, we were told the origin story about the Richmond Hill community, about how it was formerly an antebellum mansion that after the Civil War was purchased by the Catholic Diocese of Maryland, in which a community of nuns was sent. So you think of the city of Richmond after the turmoils of the Civil War, the city in fire. These nuns are sent there with the mission to pray for the city and community and the citizens who live there. They started a girls' school and this practice of daily prayer, praying for the city. But as the community grew older and it became more difficult to maintain the facilities in the 1980s, the nuns who were still living there decided that they were going to have to leave and sell the property. Several enterprising developers made offers for this prime piece of real estate in Richmond, but the community decided instead to accept the offer, a lower offer, from an ecumenical group of Christians who promised that they would continue in this founding mission of having a residential community of Christians living together and praying for the city and its residents. Origin stories are things that we repeat time and again, not only to explain, but to inspire and encourage. In confusing times, our origin stories can help us return to a sense of purpose when we seem to have lost our way. They can also be important when we have to explain ourselves before others or give an account of ourselves and what we're doing. Jesus says in our gospel reading today that you will be sent out like sheep among wolves. You'll be handed over to trials and tribunals and governmental authorities, and you'll have to give an account of yourself because of me. Today in our readings, we hear of such an account from St. Paul, who was on trial before the Roman authorities of his day. And St. Paul tells us his origin story, how it is that he came to be doing what he's doing. You know, the past couple of weeks, we've been looking at call narratives about the calling of the first disciples, which are interesting stories, but they're not satisfying origin stories. They're told from the perspective of an omniscient third-person narrator with no details or explanation. Jesus just says to the disciples, "Follow me," and they follow. But today, in our readings for the conversion of St. Paul, we get this first-person perspective, this clear narrative arc with a decisive moment of transformation that explains why Paul is doing what he's doing. He was previously violently persecuting the followers of Jesus, but then on the road to Damascus, Christ appeared to him in light, and Paul had a moment of conversion, after which he was sent out on a mission to the Gentiles. This is actually a story that's told multiple times in our scriptures. In the book of Acts, it comes up 3 different times. Paul also writes about it in his letters. And it's repeated again and again for sort of different purposes, to explain and inspire, to defend and encourage. As I mentioned, Jesus warns his disciples that they're being sent out like sheep among wolves. They'll be persecuted and put on trial because of him. But why would people want to persecute the followers of Christ? Why would they want to hand them over to governors to be executed and killed? I don't think it's just because they had a message of love. You know, people are not often persecuted and killed when they say, be kind to one another. Rather, it was a radical message that upset the status quo. The radical message of God's love and welcome that forced communities, or called communities, to confront some of their assumptions and prejudices, to really welcome everyone. So in Paul's telling of this origin story about how it came to be that he was sent out to the Gentiles, to the nations, Paul is speaking about this mystery that at once before he was a Pharisee, a Jew, who was persecuting the Christians, but then after this moment of transformation when he saw Christ in the light, he realized this mystery, that the God of Israel who raised Jesus from the dead is sending him out into the world to the Gentiles, to those who are formerly excluded and neglected, and welcoming them into the family of God, giving them a place within God's household and family. Being sent out to the neglected and the rejected with this wonderful message of love and mercy and forgiveness and welcome, which upset the status quo, because at that time in Jewish society, Gentiles were not allowed to be in the temple. People would avoid them in the street. You weren't supposed to touch them. And now here Paul is saying, no, we should welcome them in. You know, I've been looking at the origin story for this church, for St. Paul's Memorial, especially as we are celebrating our patronal feast. We'll have our annual meeting later, and it's a good way to get to know a community, to look at its history. Now, the origin story for this church, on its surface, doesn't seem so controversial. So you have Bishop Robert Gibson in 1897, who takes it as his mission when he becomes bishop to expand the mission of the church, to greet and welcome more people, to reach out to others without coming into conflict with other churches. He says, if we're gonna do this and not clash with other churches, to reach people who are not already being welcomed and supported by their churches, we need to look at those who are neglected. And so this began a focus on mission work in the mountains and different parish missions, but also here at the university. And so Bishop Gibson writes this. He says, in looking for neglected persons, or the condition of the boys at the University of Virginia caught my attention. Without criticizing in the least degree the care extended to the students by the authorities at the university, I thought that it was perfectly plain that their own church was not doing its duty for these Episcopal boys. There was this kind of concern that you have these young men who were raised in fine, upstanding Episcopal households who were coming to a university with a more liberal, free-thinking environment. They might lose their habits of religion, be led astray. We had to do something for these poor Episcopal boys. And so was founded the mission of St. Paul's. The first gathering actually took place at Madison Hall, which was the YMCA, in the smoking room. It was a smokers' meeting where they got together and talked about Jesus while they smoked their pipes and cigars. You know, I think about this now as the campus ministry person, that, you know, I get that families can be concerned about their students coming to school and wanting to make sure they're connected with the church, but I'm not sure how it would go over to say, don't worry, I'm going to invite your kids to smoke with me and talk about Jesus. So you look at the history of St. Paul's and its ups and downs. periods of dramatic growth. In its original building, it said that, which sat 300 people, they would have to turn people away because it was so amazing and wonderful and popular what was happening here. You had lectures being given to students, which I'm not sure how they would go over today, but what is behind student turmoil and apathy? Or is chastity outmoded? I'm not sure that's going to have as broad of an appeal, but at the time, hundreds would come. But at various periods in the church's history, you see in the minutes and in the writings a call to return to the origin story, to the founding mission of St. Paul's, that we needed to reinvigorate our student ministry. Remember the focus on university ministry. But also, and somewhat less explicit, but I think important, was a return to the original motivation for St. Paul's. This mission to reach out to those who are neglected and excluded, people who are not currently being welcomed and supported in other churches. And so in the 1950s, when there was these controversies about integration and desegregation, the rector of St. Paul's took a stance, advocating for integration against the segregation of schools. When asked if St. Paul's could become a private school or host a private school for white children, he said no. Other churches elsewhere, that was a common practice. In the wake of Brown versus the Board of Education, churches would host private schools so that the white children didn't have to integrate with others, with local black children. During the 1960s, in the era of civil rights, St. Paul's took an employment policy of non-discrimination, saying that we would hire people from all races. Opposed the practices of redlining. Actually, in the parish newsletter, there was a call put out to members of the church saying that if you have a home in a white neighborhood, you should list it as being open and available to everyone. The church took a stance and was an early supporter of women in leadership in the church, supporters of women's ordination, and more recently, taking a stance to be supporters of being welcoming and affirming of the LGBTQ+ community, which is still a controversial and polarizing issue in our society. But we have said, yes, we will be welcoming and affirming. Yes, you are welcome here at St. Paul's. Now, of course, for all of these issues and all of these errors, there were debates, polarization. Many members of the church supported these stances taken by the clergy and the vestry and the leadership of the church, but there were other vocal parties within the church who opposed these measures. But many more who said that the church shouldn't be involved. Stay out of politics. Don't talk about social issues from the pulpit. Don't upset the status quo. I like what the rector Theodore Evans wrote, though, in response to such calls. The Church of Christ is not a social club to encourage us in our preconceived prides and prejudices. It offers a ministry of reconciliation that we may bring others into the family of God. God did not send his Son into the world to save a select group, but to save all who would receive him. We often forget that we are members of a universal church, which is extended through time, space, and eternity to bind us in God's love. This was, I believe, the mission of St. Paul, and was and is the mission of St. Paul's Memorial.